In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you guys how to use for loops in C. Now, a for loop is a special type of loop that we can use in C, which allows us to use something called an indexing variable. And this indexing variable will basically tell us what iteration of the loop we're currently on. And we can use that indexing variable to do a bunch of stuff, like we could loop through an array of items. We could do all sorts of stuff inside of a loop. So down here in my program, you'll see that I have a while loop set up. And I have just sort of a basic while loop. And I want to show you guys what it's doing. So essentially up here, I'm saying int I is equal to 1. So I'm giving this integer I the value of 1. And I'm saying while I is less than or equal to 5, I'm going to print out the value of I, and then I'm going to increment I. So this is a very simple while loop. Basically, we have this variable I, and every time we go through the loop, we're printing it out until it's greater than 5. So let's run this program, and we'll see what it does. So you'll see over here, we're basically printing out values between 1 and 5. And I want to point out what's actually happening. So the first time that we go through this while loop, we're printing out 1. The second time, we're printing out 2. The third time, we're printing out 3. In other words, this variable I is basically telling us what iteration of the loop we're currently on. So on the first iteration of the loop, I is telling us that we're on the first iteration of the loop, right? The first time we go through the loop, I is equal to 1. Second time we go through the loop, I is equal to 2. Third time, I is equal to 3. So this variable I over here is basically telling us how many times we've gone through the loop. So on the third time, it's telling us 3, fourth time, 4, etc. And believe it or not, this is actually a very useful thing for us to have when we're looping. And so there's a lot of situations where you're going to want to know what iteration of the loop you're currently on when you're looping. So with a normal while loop, like I can basically just specify a condition up here and I can do whatever I want, right? It's very open. You can kind of just do whatever you want with it. But in a lot of situations, and there's tons of these situations, we're going to want to have a variable just like I that will tell us what iteration of the loop that we're currently on, or basically just a variable that's going to keep changing every time we go through the loop. And this is such a common situation in C that there's actually something called a for loop. And a for loop allows us to take all of this code and condense it into its own single loop. So it's taking this situation where we want to have a variable like I, and it's basically allowing us to do it a lot easier and a lot cleaner. So I'm going to show you guys how we can create a for loop. I'm going to come down here below this while loop, and I'm going to create a basic for loop structure. So I'm just going to say for, I'm going to make an open and closed parentheses and an open and closed curly bracket. Now, the difference between a for loop and a while loop is basically going to happen inside of these parentheses. So in the parentheses of a while loop, we have our loop condition or our loop guard, right? This is specifying whether or not we can keep looping through. Inside this for loop, we're going to have 3 different things. So instead of just one loop guard, we're actually going to have 3 different things that we want to put inside of here. So with a for loop, the first thing I'm going to put in here is this variable I. So you'll notice in the while loop, we have our variable I up here, and this is basically allowing us to loop through and keep track of how many times we've gone through the loop. So what I can do down here is I can do something similar. I could say like int I, and I'm not going to give this a value. Inside of here, I'm going to say I is equal to 1. So basically, I'm going to take my variable I, and I'm going to give it an initial value of 1. And now I have my I variable. I have my variable that's going to change every time we go through the loop. The next thing I want to do is include my looping condition. So up here we have I is less than or equal to 5. That's our condition. I can put the same thing down here. So I'm going to say I is less than or equal to 5. The third thing I want to do is increment I. So you'll notice down here, every time we go through this loop, we're incrementing that variable I. I'm going to do the same thing over here in this little third quadrant. So you'll notice I have these little like sections. Here's the first section. We're initializing the variable I. We're saying I is equal to 1. Here we're specifying our looping conditions. So I'm saying we're going to keep looping while I is less than or equal to 5. And over here is a little line of code that's going to get executed every time we go through the loop. So here I'm saying I++. I could also say like I minus minus, and that would decrement I. I could say like I is equal to I plus 2, etc. Like I could do basically anything I wanted over here. Let's just keep it at I++ for now. So you'll see I was basically able to take all of this code and condense it into its own little type of loop. And now instead of having to like print this out and create this variable up here, I can do all of that inside of this for loop. Now I could basically take this line of code, I could paste it down into here, and we essentially have the same thing. So right now, this block of code and this block of code are 100% equivalent. They're doing exactly the same thing. So let's go ahead and get rid of all this code and let's test out our shiny new for loop. So I'm just gonna run my program. And you'll see over here, we're getting exactly the same thing that we got before. We're printing out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's the same exact program doing the same exact thing. And that's why for loops are great, because we can take that little structure like where we have an indexing variable and we can use it with something like this. So I want to show you another situation where these for loops can come in handy, and we can use them to loop through all of the elements inside of an array. So actually up here I have this array that I created. It's called lucky numbers, and I'm just going to grab this and bring it down here. So we have this lucky numbers array. It has 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. And what I could actually do is I could loop through all of the elements inside of this array from this for loop. So I'm going to show you guys how we can do that. Now let's first off see how many elements we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 6 elements in this array. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say I is equal to 0. And you'll see why we need to do this in a second, but basically array indexes start at 0. So this first element in the array is at index position 0. And just for a little refresher, if I wanted to access one of these elements from inside the array, I could say like lucky numbers was 0, and this is going to give me access to this element. If I said lucky numbers 2, then I'll get access to this element, this 15. So this is basically how we can access an element inside the array. So I'm going to set I equal to 0, and I'm going to say I want to loop while I is less than 6. And 6 was how many elements we had in the array. So I want to keep looping as long as we're less than 6. And I'm going to say I++. Now, down here, I'm going to do this same exact thing. But instead of printing out I, I'm going to print out lucky numbers I. So I'm going to print out the array element at index position I in lucky numbers. Basically, the first time we go through this loop, we're going to be printing out lucky numbers 0. Because I is going to be equal to 0. The second time we go through the loop, we're going to be printing out lucky numbers 1, because I is going to be equal to 1, etc. And we're going to keep doing that until we get all the way up to 5, which is going to be the last element, which is this 42. So let's go ahead and do that. So I need to put this back to I, and let's run this program. So you'll see over here, we're basically doing exactly what I said. So the first time through the loop, we're printing out 4. We're printing out that first element. The second time through the loop, we're printing out 8, which is the second element, 15, 16, 23, and 42. So we're printing out all of those elements in turn as we go through this for loop. And there's a lot of situations where for loops are gonna come in handy, but this is a very, 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 very common situation where we want to loop through all the elements in an array and either print them out or do something to them, whatever. So that's the basics of working with for loops. And I do just want to say, like, anything that you do with a for loop, you could do with a while loop. I basically showed you guys how we transformed that while loop into a for loop. The thing with for loops, though, is that they're very convenient. So it makes it really easy to do something like this without having to go through all the trouble of creating a while loop.